So what we aim to do with that article, what Reverend Whitlock and I aim to do was to set the record straight about Black voting. And so Black voter turnout is much higher and much more consistent than people actually think. And Black voters, particularly Black Democratic voters, oftentimes determine elections, particularly in battleground states. In this regard, we might be talking about North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, even purple states like Georgia and Texas. And of course, Texas has a large Latino population as well. We also wanted to highlight that some of the barriers to voting isn't necessarily that people just don't vote, but is dealing with gerrymandering and voter suppression. So obviously, we know historically that Black people, similar to women, were not allowed to vote. And this month, we're celebrating the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. But on this day, we are also celebrating the Voting Rights Act. And what's interesting about celebrating the Voting Rights Act at this particular time is that the Shelby versus Holder legislation that happened several years ago led to the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act. It led to wide sweeping gerrymandering and voter suppression. So much so that over 50 polling places have closed in North Carolina and South Carolina. In Texas, over 400 polling places have closed. And we've seen that throughout the South from Arizona through the Carolinas in terms of what voter suppression actually means. We obviously know that in Georgia and Florida, that voter suppression and gerrymandering help to determine the governor races in those particular states. We also know in the state of Maryland that there have been a lot of issues about zoning and gerrymandering, how these particular uh, polling boundaries play a big role in who actually goes to Capitol Hill and who also goes to Annapolis or even their county council. So for Black people have had a long history with dealing with voter suppression, dealing with gerrymandering, dealing with tactics such as when they would try to go vote, dealing with what we call a poll tax, where people would ask them questions like, how many bubbles are on the bar of soap? How many words were in the application in order to vote? Things that should just not be in place. And even though we don't have those overt tactics anymore, we definitely have covert tactics. And when it comes to mail in ballots, that is something that people really worry about is whether or not their vote is going to count in the way that it should. And people have to pay attention to states in the DMV area. People have to pay attention to the deadlines, and they need to ensure that their ballots are in the mail weeks before the deadline for the election. So obviously, in our region and across the country, Black people and the Latino community are being hit extremely hard by COVID-19. In most places, 2 to 3 times more likely to die relative to whites. And so now we're going to be relying on a practice, a mail-in voting practice, where people actually want to see oftentimes themselves go to the poll and see their vote counted. And now we're going to be relying on mail in and absentee ballots because of COVID 19. We need to ensure that regulations are up to par. And for Black people in the United States, we have a rational paranoia about our vote not counting. But what people have to do is people have to look at the regulations that are in place. And there is still time between now and November to ensure that not just in the state of Maryland or in Virginia and DC, but across the country, because this region has influence, that across the country, that people are having equitable opportunities to vote. So we need poll watchers. We also need people to ensure that people are getting their mail ballots, that they know how to complete those ballots, and that they know how to resubmit those ballots in the mail. These are the sort of things that need to happen. And I think that it will happen. And hopefully, we'll see that everyone can be included in the democratic process. Most definitely. I mean, I think all the time people are nervous about mailing in their vote. This is the reason why people show up to the polls. Part of the problem right now, though, is that if people choose to show up to the polls because there's a higher expectation that people would do mail-in ballots, we might not have as many polling places. Now, in Maryland, we might not have to worry about that as much as we might have to worry about that in parts of rural Virginia. But in other parts around the country, we will have to worry about that. Obviously, from Kentucky to Michigan, there are news stories that have been showing people waiting in line for hours to try to vote during a pandemic. These are the sort of things that we don't need if we're trying to keep people safe. And we know that unfortunately, this particular administration has failed the American people as it relates to COVID 19. And we need to ensure that there is not a failure in our 2020 election because it's not solely about the presidency, it's also about down ballot. There are a lot of people in our region who are going to be voting for down ballot initiatives and down ballot politicians as it relates to what's happening at the local and state level. I would tell her that she can get someone to help her with the process to ensure that she can participate in the mail in ballot. We know that people who are 75 and older, 65 and older, are more exposed to the likelihood of the consequences of COVID 19. And what I've seen, and my research has documented this, I've written at Brookings, I've written for The Guardian and other outlets like Newsweek, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Dr. Todd Urey, and I wrote a piece on this that COVID 19 has literally been killing off stable Black voting blocks in battleground states from Michigan to Pennsylvania to North Carolina. So we need to ensure that we take care of our elders. We also just need to ensure that we're taking care of people who are in their 40s and 50s because COVID 19 has also been taking them out. And so, with that being said, people need to be careful. But as John Lewis said before he passed away, and as he said many times, people shed a little blood for this democratic process, and we need to be sure that we participate in it.